My husband said he didn't need my love. He lost his mind when I stopped giving it. Gerald and I had been together for 20 years and had 2 kids, Ruby, who's 12, and Max, who's 10. For the first 15 years, everything was good. We were a team, raising babies, building careers, making a home. But once the kids got older and didn't need us every second, I noticed Gerald had completely checked out of our marriage. He'd come home, eat dinner, then sit on his phone scrolling through sports forums until bed. Weekends, he'd watch football or play video games for 8 hours straight. When I'd try to talk to him, he'd grunt responses without looking up. I'd sit right next to him, and he'd angle his body away like I was bothering him. I tried everything to reconnect with us. I'd plan date nights, and he'd spend them checking work emails and texting his fantasy football league. I'd buy lingerie, and he'd say he was too tired, then stay up until 2 watching YouTube videos. I'd suggest couples activities like wine tasting or cooking classes, and he'd say that wasn't his thing. I'd cook his favorite meals from scratch, and he wouldn't notice, just eat while staring at his phone. I'd write him love notes in his lunch and find them crumpled in his car's cup holder. I'd send flirty texts during the day and get one-word replies 6 hours later. I made this jar where we could write things we loved about each other, and his side stayed empty for months. I begged him to go to the gym with the kids and me. He said he was fine how he was, and gyms were scams. I asked him to come to Ruby's dance recitals or Max's baseball games. He said one parent was enough, and they probably didn't notice anyway. I bought us this couple's questionnaire game to do together, and he said it looked stupid. I suggested therapy, and he said only broken people need therapy, and we were perfectly fine. When I'd cry and say I felt alone in our marriage, he'd roll his eyes and say I was being dramatic, that we were happy, that I expected too much from him like some romantic movie. He'd point out that he worked 40 hours a week, didn't drink too much, didn't hit me, didn't cheat, like those were accomplishments instead of the bare minimum for being human. He'd say other wives would kill for a husband who left them alone instead of demanding attention all the time like some needy toddler. About 18 months ago, we had this huge fight where I told him I needed him to try, to show me he loved me somehow, to act like he even liked me or wanted me around. He laughed and said I was too needy and exhausting. He said he didn't need me to do all that extra stuff and I was creating problems where there weren't any. He said if I wanted to waste my energy on pointless romantic gestures, that was my choice, but don't expect him to do the same because that wasn't who he was. He actually said the words, "You knew who I was when you married me," like being lazy and selfish was some core personality trait I had to accept. That's when something clicked for me. He was right. It was my choice. So I chose to stop. I stopped planning dates, stopped buying lingerie, stopped cooking elaborate meals and just made basic food for the kids and me. Stopped writing notes or sending texts, stopped asking about his day or trying to cuddle at night, stopped planning birthday parties or anniversary celebrations, stopped begging him to join family activities, stopped everything extra I'd been doing. Instead, I joined a book club that met on Tuesday evenings, started taking hot yoga classes on Thursday nights, went to coffee with friends on Saturday mornings while he slept until noon, joined a hiking group that did trails on Sundays, got certified to teach fitness classes at the community center, started learning Spanish through an app and practiced with my friend Maria. I got in the best shape of my life, read dozens of books, made actual friends who asked how I was doing and cared about the answer, learned to make pottery, took up photography. Gerald didn't notice for months. He seemed perfectly content with us being roommates who happened to share kids. We hadn't had sex in almost a year, and he never mentioned it once. We never went out together and he didn't care. I stopped saying I love you and he never said it either. He'd walk past me like I was furniture. Then his birthday came last week. I had the kids make him cards with construction paper and told him to order whatever takeout he wanted for dinner. That was it. No cake, no gift, no special breakfast, no surprise party, no weekend getaway, nothing extra. Just another Thursday with Chinese food. He seemed confused but didn't say anything until Sunday when he absolutely exploded out of nowhere. I was loading the dishwasher when Gerald came into the kitchen. His face was bright red and his hands were shaking at his sides. He started yelling about how I'd changed everything without warning him. He said I was punishing him for something he didn't understand. He asked when I became this cold person who doesn't care about our family. His voice kept getting louder with each word. I kept rinsing plates and putting them in the rack. The calmness I felt surprised me. I'd expected to feel guilty or scared or something, but instead I just felt tired. He demanded I look at him while he was talking. I turned around and dried my hands on a dish towel. His chest was heaving like he'd just run a mile. I told him I said all this 18 months ago during our big fight. I reminded him I needed him to try, to show he loved me, to act like he wanted me around. He cut me off mid-sentence and said that was just one conversation. He said I couldn't expect him to remember every little thing I said. His tone made it sound like I was being crazy for bringing up something from so long ago. I pointed out I hadn't just said it once. I'd been living differently for a year and a half. I asked if he'd noticed I stopped planning dates, stopped cooking special meals, stopped leaving notes, stopped asking about his day. He stared at me like I was speaking another language. I said he never noticed because he was too busy scrolling his phone to see what was happening right in front of him. His jaw clenched and he looked away. Gerald switched tactics fast. His voice got softer and he said he'd change now. He promised he'd take me on dates and help more around the house. He said he'd be better about putting his phone down. The words sounded rehearsed, like he'd been practicing them. I asked him why my 18 months of begging wasn't enough reason to change, but one missed birthday cake suddenly was. He opened his mouth and closed it again. No answer came out. Then his face got red again and he said I wasn't giving him a chance to fix things. He accused me of wanting the marriage to fail. He said I was being unfair by not accepting his offer to change. I told him I'd spent years accepting crumbs and calling it enough. He slammed his hand on the counter and walked out of the kitchen. I heard him go into the bedroom and slam that door too. The next few days, Gerald acted like our conversation never happened. Tuesday evening, I was making chicken nuggets and mac and cheese for Ruby and Max. Gerald came into the kitchen and asked when dinner would be ready. I told him I made food for the kids and he could order whatever he wanted. He stood there looking confused for a solid 10 seconds. Then he asked what I meant. I repeated that I made dinner for the kids, not for him. He could get takeout or make himself something. His face went through about 5 different expressions before he turned around and left. Later that evening, I was getting ready for book club. I put on jeans and a nice shirt and grabbed my purse. Gerald was on the couch watching football. He looked at me and asked where I was going. I reminded him it was Tuesday, my book club night. He said the game was on and maybe I could skip this week. I said no thanks and headed for the door. He called after me asking what he was supposed to do about the kids. I told him he was their parent and I'd be back by 9. As I pulled out of the driveway, I could see him through the window, still sitting on the couch with his phone in his hand. Ruby came into my bedroom on Thursday while I was folding laundry. She closed the door behind her and sat on the edge of my bed. She asked why Dad seemed so angry lately. Her voice was small and worried. Then she asked if we were getting divorced. I sat down next to her and put my arm around her shoulders. I told her Dad and I were working through some grown-up problems, but she and Max were loved and safe no matter what. She leaned into me and said she'd noticed I seemed happier this past year. She said Dad barely talks to anyone anymore and just sits on his phone or watches TV. I asked if she was scared. She said a little bit, but mostly she was confused about why Dad was acting so weird now when everything had been the same for so long. I realized she'd been watching this whole thing unfold way more carefully than I'd given her credit for. 2 weeks after his birthday, Gerald started making obvious attempts to engage with me. I was cooking dinner one evening and he came into the kitchen. He asked about my day. I told him it was fine. He stood there like he was waiting for me to ask about his day back, but I just kept chopping vegetables. Another night, he sat next to me on the couch during a show I was watching. He didn't look at his phone once for the whole hour. It felt forced and weird, like he was performing for an audience. On Saturday morning, he asked if he could come to my coffee meetup with my friends. I said it was a girl's thing and he wouldn't enjoy it anyway. Every single gesture felt like he was checking boxes on a list someone had given him. There was no genuine feeling behind any of it. He'd ask questions, but his eyes looked empty. He'd sit near me, but his body was stiff and uncomfortable. It was almost worse than when he'd been ignoring me because at least that had been honest. I kept going to my Tuesday book club and Thursday yoga. Saturday mornings, I met my friends for coffee while Gerald slept until noon. Sundays, I went hiking with my group. Gerald's resentment grew more visible each week. He started making comments about how I was never home anymore. I pointed out I was gone maybe 10 hours total per week. He said it felt like more than that. One Sunday morning, I was getting ready for my hike when Gerald announced he'd planned a family activity. He wanted to take the kids to this indoor trampoline place. I asked what time. He said 11 o'clock. That was exactly when my hiking group met. I told him that didn't work for me and I'd already committed to the hike. He said the kids really wanted to go and couldn't I just skip 1 week. I said he could take them without me. His face fell and he said the whole point was to do something as a family. I reminded him I'd invited him to family activities for years, and he'd always said one parent was enough. He got quiet and walked away. Later, I heard him tell the kids we couldn't go because Mom had other plans. The next week, Gerald tried a different approach. He said the kids missed having family dinners together. He said I was being selfish with all my activities. I pointed out we could have family dinners the 5 nights I was home. He got defensive and said he was just trying to keep our family together. I asked him where this concern was for the past 5 years. I reminded him he was the one who usually ate in front of the TV anyway. He said I was twisting everything to make him look bad. His voice got loud, and he said all he wanted was for things to go back to normal. I told him normal was the problem. Normal meant I did everything while he did nothing. He said that wasn't fair and I was exaggerating. I asked him to name one thing he'd done for our marriage in the past 5 years besides show up. He couldn't. At book club that Tuesday, we were discussing our current book, but somehow the conversation turned to relationships. Celine mentioned she'd noticed how much lighter and happier I seemed compared to a year ago. I hadn't planned to share anything, but the words just came out. I told them about Gerald taking me for granted for years, about me finally stopping all the extra effort, about his recent panic over losing his comfortable setup. Celine nodded like she'd heard this story before. She said her ex-husband had done the same thing. He'd ignored her completely until she stopped caring. Then suddenly he wanted attention when it affected him. She said some men don't value what they have until it's gone. The other women in the group had similar stories. Hearing them talk made me realize I wasn't crazy for having needs in my marriage. I wasn't asking for too much by wanting basic attention and respect. The validation felt good. 2 days later, Gerald's mom called. She asked if everything was okay because Gerald had mentioned we were having problems. I said we were working through some things. She got quiet for a second and then suggested I might be going through early menopause. She said hormone changes can make women act differently. Then she asked if I'd considered that I might be depressed. She said depression can make people pull away from their families. I was so shocked I didn't know what to say at first. Then I asked what Gerald had told her. She said he'd mentioned I'd changed a lot and wasn't taking care of the family like I used to. He'd said he was worried about me. I felt my face get hot. Gerald had painted himself as the concerned husband dealing with his unstable wife. He'd told his parents I was the problem without mentioning 5 years of him checking out completely. I told his mom we'd figure things out and got off the phone. When Gerald got home from work, I asked him what he'd told his mother. He said he'd just mentioned we were having some issues. I asked if he'd mentioned his part in those issues. He said he didn't see the point in giving her all the details. I realized he genuinely saw himself as the victim in all this. I went upstairs and got ready for bed without saying another word to him. The next few weeks were tense, but I kept to my routine. Book club on Tuesdays, yoga on Thursdays, coffee with friends on Saturdays, hiking on Sundays. Gerald watched me leave each time with this look on his face like he couldn't believe I was actually going. About a month after his birthday, I was folding the kids' laundry in the living room when Gerald came in from work. He looked at the basket and then at me. He asked where his work shirts were. I told him they were in the hamper where he'd left them. He stared at me for a second and then said, "I always did the laundry on Wednesdays." I said I did the kids' laundry and mine on Wednesdays. He could do his own whenever he wanted. His face got red and he said laundry was a wife thing. I kept folding Max's t-shirts and told him we were both adults with jobs. He was capable of reading the instructions on the washing machine. He said I was being petty and keeping score instead of being a team. I looked up at him and asked when the last time was that he'd done anything to make us a team. He didn't answer, just grabbed his phone and went to the bedroom. The next morning, there was no lunch packed in the fridge for him. He asked about it and I said he could make a sandwich or buy something. He called me childish on his way out the door. 2 weeks later, I came home from yoga on a Thursday night and found a babysitter in my living room. The girl said Gerald had called her and asked her to watch the kids for a few hours. I was confused until Gerald came down the stairs wearing khakis and a button-up shirt. He said he'd planned a surprise date night for us. I asked why he hadn't checked with me first. He said it was supposed to be a surprise and we needed this. I was annoyed that he'd just assumed I'd drop everything, but the babysitter was already there and paid. We went to this Italian place we used to go 2 years ago. Gerald kept trying to make conversation, but he'd check his phone every few minutes. He'd ask about my day and I'd start to answer. Then his phone would buzz and he'd look at it. After the third time, I just stopped talking. He didn't notice for almost a minute. Then he put his phone face down on the table and said he was really trying here. I said one dinner didn't erase 5 years of him ignoring me. He got defensive and said he thought I'd be happy he was making an effort. I told him effort meant consistent change over time, not one fancy meal when he got scared. We ate the rest of dinner in silence. On the drive home, he said he didn't know what else I wanted from him. I didn't answer because I wasn't sure anymore either. The following Saturday morning, I was sitting in my car outside the coffee shop before meeting my friends. I'd gotten there early and just sat there thinking. I realized I'd spent so long trying to get Gerald's attention that I'd never asked myself if I even wanted this marriage anymore. The thought scared me, but also felt freeing somehow. I'd built this whole life outside our relationship over the past year and a half. I had friends who actually cared about my answers when they asked how I was. I had hobbies that made me feel good about myself. I'd gotten in the best shape of my life. I taught fitness classes and people told me I inspired them. I'd learned to make pottery and took photos that people said were beautiful. I genuinely liked the person I'd become without Gerald. I sat there wondering if maybe I'd outgrown this marriage. If maybe I deserved more than a husband who only tried when he thought he might lose his comfortable setup. The idea of divorce after 20 years was huge and scary. But so was the idea of spending another 20 years feeling invisible. That Sunday afternoon, Max came into the kitchen while I was making dinner. He had this worried look on his face. He asked if it was true that I didn't appreciate anything Dad did. I stopped chopping vegetables and asked where that came from. He said he'd heard Dad on the phone with his friend yesterday. Dad had said Mom didn't appreciate anything and made him feel like nothing he did was good enough. Max wanted to know if that was true. I knelt down so I was at his level and told him that sometimes adults see situations differently. Dad and I were working on understanding each other better. I said it was grown-up stuff that had nothing to do with him or Ruby. Max asked if we were getting divorced. I told him I didn't know what would happen, but he and Ruby were loved no matter what. He hugged me and then went back to his room. I felt angry that Gerald was telling his version to other people without mentioning his part in our problems. I also felt guilty that the kids were picking up on everything, even though we tried to keep it from them. The next Wednesday, Gerald came home from work earlier than usual. He looked shaken up. I asked if everything was okay, and he said his boss had called him into a meeting. Apparently his work performance had gone down a lot over the past month. He'd missed deadlines and made mistakes on reports. His boss had asked if something was going on at home. Gerald admitted he'd been distracted. His boss told him he needed to get it together, or there could be consequences. Gerald sat down at the kitchen table and put his head in his hands. He said he couldn't focus on anything anymore. Everything was falling apart, and he didn't know how to fix it. For the first time, he seemed to realize his life was a mess beyond just our marriage. He couldn't just coast through everything anymore. I felt a little bad for him, but also thought maybe this was what he needed. Maybe he needed to see that his choices had consequences in every part of his life, not just at home. Over the next few weeks, I spent a lot of time thinking about what I actually wanted. I'd sit in my car after yoga or hiking and just think. I made lists of pros and cons about staying versus leaving. On the staying side, I wrote things like 20 years together, the kids having both parents in one house, financial stability, fear of starting over. On the leaving side, I wrote things like feeling invisible, doing all the emotional work, not being able to trust his changes would last, wanting more than the bare minimum. I talked to Celine about it over coffee one Saturday. She said only I could decide what was right for me. But she also said I deserved to be with someone who actually wanted to be with me, not someone who only tried when forced. I thought about that a lot. I also thought about how I'd spent 18 months building this life that made me happy. If I stayed with Gerald, would I have to give that up to make room for fixing our marriage? Or could I keep being this version of myself? I sat with all these feelings instead of rushing to fix everything for Gerald's comfort like I used to. It felt strange, but also good to put myself first for once. 3 months after his birthday, Gerald came to my room late one night. I was reading in bed and he knocked on the doorframe. He asked if he could talk to me. I said okay, and he sat on the edge of the bed. Then he started crying. Not just a few tears, but actual sobbing. He said he was scared of losing his family. He said he knew he'd taken me completely for granted for years. He talked about how his dad had been the same way with his mom. His dad would come home and ignore everyone, and his mom would do everything. Gerald said he'd grown up thinking that was just how marriage worked. He'd never learned what real partnership looked like. He said he knew that wasn't an excuse, but it was the truth. He said he loved me and the kids more than anything, but he'd been a terrible husband. He asked if there was any way I could forgive him. It was the first time he'd been genuinely open instead of defensive or trying to manipulate me. I could tell he actually meant it this time. I told Gerald I appreciated him being honest with me. But I also said one emotional conversation wasn't enough after years of neglect. I explained that if we were going to fix this marriage, he needed to do real work. Not just trying for a few weeks and then going back to his old ways. I meant actual therapy, consistent effort over months, genuine behavior change that stuck. I told him I wasn't going to go back to doing all the emotional labor while he did the bare minimum and expected praise for it. I said I needed to see real change that lasted, not just panic when he thought he might lose everything. He asked what he needed to do, and I told him to start with finding a therapist. He nodded and said he would. I told him I was serious, and he said he knew. Then he went back to his room. I lay there in the dark, wondering if he'd actually follow through or if this was just another panic moment that would fade. The next week, Gerald came home and told me he'd found a therapist. He had an appointment scheduled for Thursday afternoon. I was surprised, but tried not to show it too much. He actually went to that appointment and came home and told me it had been hard but good. He scheduled another one for the following week. Then he went again. And again. He kept going every week without me having to remind him or nag him about it. After about a month, I started noticing small changes. He began doing his own laundry without complaining. He cooked dinner a few times, nothing fancy but actual meals. He put his phone away during family dinners and asked the kids about their days. He asked me about my book club and yoga classes with real interest, not just going through the motions. When I'd come home from hiking on Sundays, he'd ask about the trails and actually listen to my answers. The changes felt more genuine than his earlier attempts. He wasn't doing things for praise or to check boxes. He seemed to actually care. I was still cautious and watching to see if it would last. But for the first time in a long time, I felt a tiny bit of hope. 4 months into Gerald's therapy, football playoffs started. I came home on Saturday afternoon after coffee with friends and found Gerald on the couch. The TV was on and he had his phone in his hand. He'd been there since I left 3 hours earlier. Sunday was the same thing. He watched games all day, barely moving except to get food. It was like stepping back in time to how things used to be. I felt disappointed but not really surprised. Part of me had been waiting for him to backslide. Monday night at dinner, I pointed out that he'd spent the entire weekend glued to the TV like old times. He got defensive immediately and said it was just playoffs. I said it was the same pattern as before. He started to argue and then stopped himself. He took a breath and said I was right. He apologized and said he'd slipped back into old habits. He didn't make excuses or try to justify it. He just owned it. That meant more to me than if he'd been perfect all along. It showed me he was actually learning something in therapy. He was catching himself and correcting instead of just getting mad at me for pointing it out. Ruby's dance recital was scheduled for 6 months after Gerald started therapy. She'd been practicing this routine for weeks, and I'd watched her go through the moves in our living room over and over until she had every step perfect. The recital was on a Friday night at the community center, and I told Ruby I'd be there early to get a good seat. I didn't mention anything to Gerald about it. I figured he'd either show up or he wouldn't, and I wasn't going to beg him anymore. I got there 30 minutes early and sat in the third row where I could see the whole stage. Other parents filled in around me, all of them holding flowers and cameras. I had my phone ready to record Ruby's performance. The lights dimmed and the first group of dancers came out. I kept glancing at the door, not sure if I was hoping Gerald would walk through it or dreading that he might. Then about 5 minutes before Ruby's group was supposed to go on, I saw him slip into the back of the auditorium. He spotted me and made his way down the aisle, sitting in the empty seat I'd left next to me. He didn't say anything, just nodded at me, and then turned his attention to the stage. His phone stayed in his pocket the entire time. When Ruby's group came out, I felt my chest get tight with pride watching her in her costume with her hair pulled back. The music started and she moved through the routine perfectly, hitting every mark, every turn, every jump exactly like she'd practiced. I recorded the whole thing, but I also just watched her, really watched her, seeing how confident and happy she looked up there. When it ended, everyone clapped and the dancers took their bows. Ruby scanned the audience, and I saw her face light up when she spotted both of us sitting together. After the recital, we waited in the lobby while Ruby changed back into regular clothes. When she came out, Gerald crouched down to her level and told her he loved the part where she did that spin in the middle and that her timing on the jumps was perfect. Ruby's whole face glowed as he talked about specific moments from her performance. She told him about how hard that spin was to get right, and he listened like what she was saying actually mattered to him. On the drive home, Ruby sat in the back seat talking nonstop about the recital and her friends and what songs they might do next year. Gerald asked her questions and made comments, actually engaging with her instead of just grunting responses. I realized how much the kids had needed him to show up, not just physically but actually be present and interested in their lives. It wasn't just me who'd been feeling invisible all these years. That night after the kids went to bed, Gerald and I sat at the kitchen table with cups of tea. He said he wanted to talk about what our marriage could look like going forward. I felt nervous but also ready for this conversation. He admitted he couldn't promise he'd be perfect from now on, that he'd probably mess up sometimes and fall back into old patterns, but he said he wanted to keep trying, to keep working on himself and on us. I told him I appreciated his honesty, but that I needed to see sustained effort for at least 6 more months before I'd fully trust that these changes were real and not just temporary. I explained that I'd been hurt too many times by brief attempts that faded as soon as things got comfortable again. He nodded and said he understood. I suggested we try couples therapy together while he continued his individual sessions. He agreed without hesitation, which surprised me. We talked about what we each needed from the other, what our boundaries were, what we hoped our relationship could become. It felt like the first real conversation we'd had in years, where we were both actually listening and trying to understand instead of just defending ourselves. Over the next several months, Gerald maintained most of his behavior changes. He had occasional small backslides, like the weekend he spent too much time on his phone or the night he forgot to help with dishes. But he caught himself each time and corrected it without me having to point it out. We started having regular date nights on Wednesday evenings where he actually put his phone away and talked to me like he was interested in what I had to say. We split household chores more fairly, with him doing his own laundry and cooking dinner twice a week. He went to Max's baseball games and Ruby's dance practices, sitting in the bleachers and actually watching instead of staring at his phone. I kept my book club on Tuesdays and yoga on Thursdays and hiking on Sundays because I'd learned I needed those things for myself regardless of our marriage status. Those activities and friendships had become part of who I was now, and I wasn't giving them up. Gerald never asked me to. He seemed to understand that me having my own life made me happier, and that made our relationship better too. Nearly a year after Gerald exploded over his birthday, our marriage still wasn't perfect. We still had disagreements and moments of frustration with each other, but it was genuinely better than it had been in years. I felt proud of myself for setting boundaries and not backing down when things got hard and uncomfortable. Gerald still had work to do and probably always would, but he was doing the work consistently now instead of expecting me to carry everything alone. We were building something more equal and honest than what we'd had before. For the first time in years, I felt hopeful about our future together instead of just resigned to it.